again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. My name is Mars, and today we're going to talk about the lie of power creep. And I know this is a little bit crazy sounding or a little bit clickbaity, but there's some real rationale behind it. A lot of people make their decisions on which units to invest in or who to save for or who to spend their in-game resources on based on power creep, and today we're going to talk about why you might be misled as to which units are the most valuable for you to invest in, or whether or not you even need to invest at all. And that's what we're going to talk about within the context of the game, and even talk about some of the things that the game should do to make it more interesting for people who kind of can rest on their laurels. So we're going to incorporate a little bit of illustrative math, and there are no numbers involved. It's simply illustrative. So this graph that we have right here is an illustration of power creep, how it moves. And now I understand that it's going to be shaped a little bit differently. You know, there may be some ups and downs, and this represents the power of units as they are released. So as this line continues on, the overall power of the units in the game increases over time. Now, like I said, there's going to be some ups, there's going to be some downs. It's going to look more jagged like this than this on the whole. And it may even be an exponential curve. It may have a slight upward incline to it. Regardless, this is used for illustrative purposes for us to help kind of visualize what power creep looks like. And also because I can't really make curved lines in this thing because this is a caveman's tool. Now, to look a little bit more at what the power creep line actually looks like I was saying, there are some ups, there are some downs. And most notably, there are points in time where there are shifts in what it means to be a powerful unit. A very practical example is how when Orlando was first introduced, he showed us what it really meant to be a chainer, and a self-contained damage-dealing chainer with an imperil. Really amazing unit. He redefined what it meant to be a chaining damage dealer. And then the next sort of major step up in power was Hyoh, and then after that, you know, we're anticipating Akstar or CG Lightning or CG Bartz, you know, these units that are gonna innovate what it means to be powerful within their respective roles. And you can apply this to any role, whether it's tanks, healers, support units, and some of them are a little less severe. Like I would say the power creep in support units is very, very slight compared to the power creep of damage dealers, which seems to increase at a much greater rate. And then of course the other thing to keep in mind is that units do get their enhancements, so they do leapfrog each other from time to time, where, you know, Hyoh, you know, was top dog for a while, and then, you know, Akstar will come out afterwards. Hyoh will get his enhancements, and that will bump him up in power significantly, and they kind of, you know, they jump over top of each other. So it's definitely not a static position, especially with units that have 7-star forms or are awaiting enhancements. They can definitely move up the line. Now, this is what most people visualize when they visualize power creep. They look at this graph and they're like, yeah, obviously the next big jump I need to go for is Akstar, or I need to hold out until CG Lightning or CG Bartz to go for that next big jump in power. But if you're using this to make your decisions on which units to get, then you may be doing yourself a disservice, because there's another line. And this line represents the difficulty of content. And you have to understand that this line does not move in a straight or even like a curved line or anything. It's not smooth at all. It is a step, like a stair step looking line, because every time a new trial is released, or every time the most difficult piece of content is released, it creates a new standard of difficulty. And so if you dial into that more, you can look at, like, for example, when Gilgamesh or Dark Espers were out, they were some of the first trials that we had, and they kind of set the standard for trials. But as more trials and more endgame came out, the difficulty escalated over time. But in the time between trial releases, the power or the difficulty of the content in the game did not change. The hardest content in the game, for example, during Aigaion's time, was Aigaion. They released other things during that time, none of which came even close to the difficulty of Aigaion. And then of course when Malboro came out, the GLX trial, that set the new standard of most difficult content. And so for that reason, once those pieces of content come out, there's a flat line. We're waiting for the next thing to redefine for us what difficult content looks like. So when we're considering power creep, this line may actually be more influential than the power of the characters that are coming out. And we'll illustrate this by overlaying the two lines over top of each other. Now, we've put power in red and content difficulty in blue. And what you'll see is that the content difficulty line only rarely passes above the red line. And in fact, the content difficulty line will never go higher than the power line at the same time. So for example, we will never have a content release that is harder than all of the units that we currently have. That's what that would represent. What we do have though, is we can see that as the power increases, as noted by that first bump in power, you can see that the white dotted line represents all of the units behind it that may become obsolete. And of course, it's not a guarantee. There's always exceptions to the rules. But basically anything that is now in power beneath that new ceiling set by the content difficulty line, those units may be obsolete for that content. And then of course, the highest power units at the time of the content's release and going forward, those are your meta units. Those are your best units in the game to equip that, or to handle that content. Now, the sloped line in between those 2 points, the obsolete line and meta, that's kind of where I like to play, where there's an awful lot of units that can do a great job at clearing that new current challenging content, but often go unrecognized because the meta is usually the first thing that we see. So here's a practical illustration of what that might look like, and this of course is just an example. I don't follow the timeline of all the character and trial releases very well. But you can see if, for example, Aigaion was released, you get a bump in power, and then that first white line that intersects the power line, all of the units that are beneath that line or before it, those units are going to be essentially obsolete for that current content. And you'll see I put examples like Thencred or Shentoto or Furion, and these units are units that are not equipped to handle the new standard of challenging content. But you'll see that there are units that are above that line that are still viable, but maybe not the best units to handle it. So you have Victoria or Lexa or Earth Veritas as your examples. Now, what this means with them being so close to the line is that the next time we get a creep in power, they actually may no longer be relevant, or they might be. And this game is so complicated that you can usually make use of units that may be considered obsolete in general. And then of course, at the time of Aigaion's release, which is where that second white line is annotated, that's where your meta begins, and then all characters that come after that point, they're going to be your best characters to take on Aigaion. And of course, there are exceptions, characters that can't damage the boss or that are otherwise ill-equipped to deal with the boss. Obviously, they have nothing to do with the new most challenging content, but across an entire trend and throughout the whole game, this is just a pattern that we can observe. So, this graph, I've tuned this one a little bit to be less of an example. This one is scaled to be a little bit more illustrative of the state of Global Edition, okay? With the blue line going up, we had Venomous Vines, which that's a pretty challenging trial, at least upon release, and that was because we didn't have all of the tools that we needed to make it easy, such as a 7-star breaker. But as the power line has gone up, you can see that the point where 7-star units start, which I would say is, where the red line starts, it starts well above Venomous Vines, which means that 7-star units on the whole are relatively well equipped to handle Venomous Vines. Of course, leaving out exceptions, because like Circe, for example, she can't even damage Venomous Vines, but if she could, she's on a level of power where she would be relevant. So anyways, Venomous Vines, an example of a trial that came out that did not preclude any 7-star units. Moving on though, one of the things that we are expecting in the future is Gilgamesh Kai, or Gilgamesh Reborn, and this is something that's been talked about a lot. A lot of people are excited about this because this is the next generation of difficult content. Now, what this will do is that this will bump the content difficulty line upwards, and anything that's past that intersecting point on the line of the white dotted line, those could be 7-star units that are now power crept, or they're officially not suited for the most challenging content. But you will notice that there's an awful lot of units that came out that are still completely viable for the content, and that's the whole stretch of the red above the content difficulty line. Now, why does this matter? You may be wondering this. Okay, Mars, you've rambled about, how there's a content line and a power line or whatever. Why does this all matter? This matters because it's the trials that determine the strength of the unit and not a calculator, which is how a lot of relative power for units is assessed. People will throw a character and their best builds or their most budget builds or whatever, they'll throw all that into a calculator and spit out a number for their rotation and say, oh, well, this character has this theoretical number and therefore they're the best damage dealer in the game. Well, it's not that simple, and just because a unit puts out a better number in a calculator does not mean that they're a better equipped unit for a fight. I think Jiraiya is a great example of this because after his enhancements, he's basically at Hyoh's level of damage, according to a lot of these calculations, with some variance, of course. Everybody's going to put out different things and different considerations, but because of the innate amount of man-eater passives that he has against Gilgamesh Kai, or Gilgamesh Reborn, whatever you choose to call it, Jiraiya may actually be one of the best damage dealers in the game to handle that fight upon release. And another thing to consider is that one unit being stronger than another doesn't make the older unit weak. So I know we've had Hyoh for a long time and we've scarcely had enough content to, run him through the ringer. We had Venomous Vines and we've had maybe a couple of other incidental things where we get to try Hyoh against, but nothing really to test his mettle. Now since Hyoh, we've had plenty of damage dealers that have come out that are more powerful than him. Jekta is one of the most recent examples, who is definitely a fair amount stronger than Hyoh. But does that mean that Hyoh's no longer sufficient for content that we have now or for content that we have coming? Of course not. A new unit being better does not make an old unit bad. Because again, it's calculated, but the fight will ultimately determine which units are the most efficient for it. Now, other things to keep in mind with this is that most supports, tanks, and breakers that we have now are plenty sufficient for all current and upcoming content. And this is important to keep in mind because a lot of people will talk about the effectiveness of different tanks or different supports or different breakers or things like that down the road. But until a piece of content comes out that power creeps an old support or an old tank at 7 stars, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the theoretical is. It doesn't matter what people are mathing out or saying about survivability or math or numbers or any of this. It's irrelevant until that piece of content comes to us. And it's at that point that you can make the decision, okay, are the supports, the tanks, and the breakers that I have now, are they good enough to get me through this content? And of course, this is a mindset for a lot of people who are, kind of beating content as it comes to us. If you're someone who's trying to get through, trying to get caught up on content, take comfort in knowing that all of the 7-star units that we have in the game currently can have a place in helping you clear content that we currently have in the game. Which brings me to that next point, which is that more units are viable and worth it than you may realize. And it's because most people evaluate units against each other and not against the content. So for example, Roy, when compared against other breakers or against other buffers, he is pretty lackluster, but if you compare him against content that he can enable you to beat with relative ease, he's a pretty flexible and useful unit, and there may be people out there who are still at that stage in the game where a unit like him will be helpful. And who knows, he could end up being a good choice for future content as well. Now, there's basically a couple of bottom lines to this whole thing, because I know I've been rambling. I've been talking about which units are most important. I've been talking about, ignore the power creep curve, pay attention to the content curve, because that should dictate whether or not you should pull, right? Well, the important thing to keep in mind at all times is that the hardest content in the game only accounts for less than like 0.1%, okay? Not an actual math number, but I'm being hyperbolic here. It accounts for 0.1% of the total content in the game. If you're stuck, or if you're finding that you're not enjoying the end-game content, or it's roadblocking you or whatever, forget about it. Enjoy the other 99.9% of the game. Use the units that you love, throw the meta out the window, do what you want, because at the end of the day, you can wait another 6 months, and that fight will be much easier with newer units that come along in that due time as well. So that's why this matters a lot, is because you can just enjoy the game. I think a lot of people are like, oh, new fight, I gotta go beat it right now. Not true. You know, you can sit on your old units, see how far into the game you can get, and only start pulling once you really feel the pressure from the content, that is. Now, the final, most ultimate bottom line of this whole thing is that if the difficulty of the content does not elevate, or there is an insufficient amount of challenging content, then there is no need or desire to acquire new units. And this most specifically applies to the people who have been playing the game the longest. We're the tried, we're the true, we're the fans who have been playing for a long time. If we do not receive content, we don't have any desire to pull. There's no reason to. And new units and new banners, that does not count as content. That does not content make, okay, you understand? We have to have challenging content to take these units against for there to be any sort of gratification or validation in that investment. And that, for me, is one of the things that I think the developers can do a great job of improving on, is finding ways to challenge players more. And I think Awakened Hasugo, you know, they didn't make it an overly difficult trial in terms of things like tank checks or break requirements and things like that. They did put a gimmick in it that made it challenging for some people, which is, it's a novelty, it's nice. If it were a permanent trial, I'd be like, well, that's kind of a lame trial. But, you know, it's a nice breath of fresh air. Let's get more things that challenge players, that provide us challenging content. And if we don't get that, the wise players are just going to sit on their in-game resources. They're not going to pull for units, they're not going to pull on banners, because they know that the content is what dictates the difficulty of the game, not the units. So that's basically everything I wanted to say about this. I rambled about this on a stream of mine a couple weeks ago, and I was like, you know what? This is something I do want to talk about because it influences a lot of my decisions as well. And of course, there's always the golden rule of pick and pull for the units that you care about, the ones that you love, the ones that are the most fun using, because if it can't beat the one hardest trial in the game, so what? Go enjoy the other 99.9% of the game. That's what it's there for. And that's kind of how I've approached the game. I use the units that I want, the units that I love, and right now we're in a spot where basically no 7-star units are power crept. And even with Gilgamesh Kai, they still might not be power crept. And that's what I look forward to seeing, is what we can do with the units that we have going forward and how we can get use out of them. So anyways, I think I've rambled on long enough. What do you think about this? Is this something that you've thought about before? Am I inventing this, or am I showing this to you for the first time? Please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about this, and whether or not this is something that you think is important to consider when pulling for units or making your choices in the game. So I'll see everybody in the comments, and I'll catch everybody in the next video.